So, here I am, spilling this mess out on Reddit because, honestly, I need some outside perspective. I'm Charles. My wife, Catherine, and I have been married for 25 years. At least, I thought we were married in every sense of the word. We've been through everything together, from job losses to medical scares, to watching our kids grow up. I thought we were solid, unbreakable. Turns out, I was wrong. It all started so small, like a pebble you'd never notice at first. Catherine lost her wedding ring. Just came up one day and said it was gone. She was doing that new yoga class she'd started going to, and she claimed it must have slipped off somehow during class. I thought, all right, no big deal. She wasn't even that worked up about it, which struck me as strange. Catherine always loved that ring, talked about it like it was one of the best days of her life when I gave it to her. She wore it for 25 years without taking it off much, and now, all of a sudden, it's gone? But she brushed it off, laughed, and said she'd buy one of those silicone bands instead. I didn't like the feeling in my gut, but I ignored it. Maybe she was just moving on from things that used to matter. She's been saying she wanted to find herself more lately, whatever that means. At the time, I didn't push back too much. After all, it's just a ring, right? Besides, she said, we're solid, so I figured I'd let it go. But then, not long after, I found a used condom in her car. Her car, where she drives our kids around, where we've made countless road trips as a family. And this thing was just there, under the passenger seat, as if it had been forgotten about. I remember feeling like my blood froze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, just staring at it with this weird mix of horror and anger. Suddenly, that little pebble from before? It felt more like a boulder crashing down. I didn't confront her right away. I mean, what was I supposed to say? I wasn't ready for her to look me in the eyes and tell me that everything I believed about our life was a lie. But I couldn't pretend everything was okay either, so I did the only thing I could think of. I called my sister, Eva. Eva lives a few states over. We didn't grow up close, but as adults, we've stayed in touch. She'd never even met Catherine because life had kept her too far to make it to our wedding. Still, she's family, and the one person I could count on. So, I told her what was going on, right down to the lost ring and that thing I found in the car. And I could tell she was as horrified as I was, but she stayed calm and told me she'd help however she could. She signed up for the yoga class Catherine was going to, just to keep an eye on things. It felt extreme, but at this point, I didn't care. I needed the truth, even if it wrecked me. Eva drove down and didn't tell a soul she was here, and I'll never forget that day because it felt like the beginning of the end, like I was staring down a cliff and about to jump. The day Eva called me back, my heart was pounding before I even answered. I don't know if it was fear, hope, or something else entirely, but I had to know. She told me Catherine arrived at yoga like usual, chatting with the instructor, all friendly. Eva didn't interact with her, just kept her distance. The class went on like normal, nothing weird, but as they were winding down, Eva noticed Catherine kept checking her phone. Every few minutes, she'd glance down, like she was waiting for something. After class, while everyone else started to roll up their mats and head out, Catherine slipped out early, claiming she had to get home. But Eva kept her distance and followed her. Instead of going home like she'd said, Catherine drove downtown and parked near a club I'd never even heard of, a place I'm sure I've never set foot in. She waited in the car for maybe 10 minutes, staring at her phone, looking almost nervous. And then a man walked up to her car. Eva watched him lean down, talking to her through the window, his hand casually resting on the doorframe. They were close, laughing and smiling, and there was something about the way they looked at each other that made Eva's stomach turn. My sister told me she didn't recognize the guy, but he looked about our age, maybe a little younger. Athletic build. Clean cut. He leaned down, kissed Catherine right there on the cheek, and then opened the door for her like they were heading into the club for a night out. Eva stayed back, watching from a distance, trying to figure out what to do. She said she felt sick just watching it unfold. And that's when she noticed a guy standing by the club entrance. He was watching Catherine and this mystery guy too, kind of smirking. His face looked familiar to Eva somehow, and that's when it hit her. She knew him, in a roundabout way, from back home. His name was Tim, and he used to go to the same gym as her years ago. She'd heard rumors about him, things she dismissed at the time, but suddenly those rumors didn't seem so far off. Eva's not one to dive into other people's business, but seeing Tim there, watching Catherine, she got an idea. After Catherine and the guy went inside, Eva hung around, trying to act casual. She eventually caught Tim's attention, struck up some small talk, and before long, managed to steer the conversation to the couple who'd just walked in. Tim gave her this sly grin, and that's when she knew. He was in on whatever was going on with Catherine. After some back and forth, Tim admitted he knew Catherine, saying she was quite the regular at that club. And then he dropped the bombshell. Apparently she was married, but she'd told him she was separated. He mentioned he had a video of her with that guy in a back room. My sister couldn't believe it and asked if he'd be willing to show that in court if it came to that. Tim's expression changed a bit, almost like he realized he'd said too much, but after a moment, he nodded. Yeah, he said, I'd help out. Can't stand people who play games like that. He looked like he'd been burned himself at some point. Whatever the reason, he was willing to help. Hearing all this from Eva, I didn't even know what to think. Part of me wanted to run straight to Catherine and demand answers, but another part of me knew I couldn't go in half-cocked. I needed a plan, and I needed proof, real proof. I thanked Eva, told her to keep everything quiet, and promised I'd take it from here. Hanging up, I felt that gut-wrenching mix of anger and dread. My marriage felt like a house of cards, and I had just knocked on the door, ready to watch it all come crashing down. After that call, I was up all night, staring at the ceiling, going over every moment with Catherine that felt even a little bit off. 25 years together, and now I was questioning everything. Every late night, every girl's trip, every time she seemed distracted. But this felt different. I wasn't just seeing ghosts, I had proof, and I knew I had to act on it. The next morning, I decided to put on a brave face. I went about my day, pretending everything was fine. Catherine was her usual self, going through her routine, chatting with me over breakfast, completely unaware. And that look on her face, calm, happy, maybe even a little bit smug, almost made me sick. But I kept it together, kept playing the part. I reached out to a lawyer that afternoon, someone a buddy of mine had recommended. We had a long conversation, and he laid out my options. He said if I could gather solid evidence, a divorce could work in my favor. But he warned me, things might get ugly, and I needed to be ready for a fight. And it wasn't just about Catherine, it was about protecting my life, my home, and even my dignity. That conversation made everything feel real, like the pieces were locking into place. A few days passed, and I couldn't shake the image of Catherine with that guy outside the club. I couldn't wait any longer. I wanted to hit her with the truth, let her know I wasn't some fool she could play anymore. So one night, when she was just about to sit down for dinner, I took a deep breath and said, "We need to talk." She looked up, surprised. "What's on your mind?" I couldn't look away from her face, trying to spot any sign of guilt. "I know about your outings," I said, keeping my tone steady. "The ring, the yoga classes, all of it." "I know everything, Catherine." Her face went pale, but she held herself together, barely blinking. "Charles, what are you talking about?" She tried to laugh it off, acting like I was crazy, but I could see the cracks. I leaned in, voice calm but sharp. "Don't lie to me. I know about the club. I know about the man you've been meeting there. I know about Tim. I know there's even a video of you cheating." The words felt cold coming out of my mouth, but it was like releasing a pressure valve that had been building for weeks. Catherine's calm mask slipped, and her eyes widened, just for a second. Then, she changed tactics, softening her voice, putting on this wounded, desperate look. "Charles, please," she whispered, reaching for my hand. "I know I've made mistakes, but it didn't mean anything. It was just, I don't even know why I did it. Her voice cracked, and for a moment, she looked vulnerable, but I knew better than to fall for it. I pulled my hand away. You knew exactly what you were doing. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise. You had your fun, but now it's over. She started crying, begging me to understand, saying it was a mistake, and that she still loved me, that she was just confused. We can fix this, Charles. We can go back to how things were. I made a huge mistake, but I'll do anything to make it right. But her words didn't reach me. I'd made up my mind. After years of trying to be the husband who let things go, who trusted without question, I wasn't about to let her turn this around. No, Catherine. It's too late for that, I said firmly. You crossed a line you can't uncross. We'll have our day in court, and we'll let the truth come out there. Her face crumpled, realizing that I wasn't going to let this go. I got up and walked away, hearing her sobs behind me, but I didn't look back. It was time to end this chapter and move on, no matter how painful it was going to be. The days after our confrontation were like walking through a fog. I felt numb, going through the motions, still in the same house as Catherine but barely able to stand the sight of her. She was doing everything she could to look remorseful, to prove she'd changed, but I'd already seen what I needed to see. There was no going back. That's when I reached out to Tim. I didn't want to, but I needed his testimony if this went to court. His video was the nail in the coffin, proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. It took some time to track him down, but eventually, I got his number from my sister, Eva. She warned me to be careful, that Tim might have his own angle, but I didn't care. All I wanted was the truth. When I called him, he answered with this casual, almost careless tone. Hello. Tim, this is Charles, I said, my voice cold. We need to talk. I know you've been with Catherine. I'm not looking to start a fight. I just need your side of things. There was a pause. And then he sighed. Yeah, I figured this might happen someday, he admitted, sounding almost annoyed. Look, man, I didn't know she was married at first. She told me she was single, separated. She didn't exactly give me the full story, you know. Hearing it come from him made my blood boil, but I kept calm. She lied to me too. Look, I'm not here to argue with you. I just want the truth so we can end this thing cleanly. I need whatever evidence you have, for court if it comes to that. Tim was silent for a moment, then agreed to meet. He sounded almost relieved, like he wanted to get this off his chest, too. He told me to meet him at a small diner on the edge of town, a place he said was quiet and out of the way. I agreed and hung up, feeling a strange mix of dread and determination. The next day, I pulled up to the diner, spotting Tim right away. He was sitting in a corner booth, leaning back with his arms crossed, looking bored. As I walked over, he gave me a quick nod, like this was some routine meeting. I sat down across from him, and we were both silent for a few seconds, sizing each other up. Look, I'm sorry it had to come to this, he started, not meeting my eyes. I didn't know she was married until later. She made it sound like it was just a fling, something harmless. By the time I figured it out, I was already in too deep. It's not like she was the only one lying. I didn't respond, just watched him, waiting. Finally, he pulled out his phone and slid it across the table. Here. It's all there. The videos, the texts, everything she said about you, about your marriage. I stared at the phone for a second, feeling a sick twist in my gut. Part of me didn't want to see it, didn't want to know just how deep this betrayal went. But I took the phone anyway, scrolling through the photos and videos, each one worse than the last. There she was, my wife, laughing, smiling, looking at Tim like he was the only man in the world. And the things she said, it felt like I was reading about a stranger. You're willing to testify if it comes to that? I asked, my voice steady despite the rage simmering inside me. He nodded, his face serious. Yeah. I know I've done some messed up things, but I'm not about to lie under oath. I'll back you up, For whatever that's worth. I slid his phone back to him and nodded. That's all I need. I appreciate it. We shook hands, a brief, tense exchange, and I got up to leave. As I turned to go, Tim called after me, his voice quiet but firm. For what it's worth, Charles, I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want to ruin anything. She came to me, and I got caught up in it. I didn't look back, just walked out and headed to my car. The truth, the reality of it, felt heavier than I'd imagined. Catherine had lied, cheated, and twisted our life into something unrecognizable, but now I had what I needed. I had the proof, and I had the resolve to follow through. When I got home that night, Catherine was waiting in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch like she'd been preparing a speech. She glanced up as I came in, trying to read my expression, but I kept my face blank. I had no energy left to fight, to argue, to even explain what I'd just been through. I was done with words. She broke the silence first, her voice low, trying to sound sincere. Charles, we need to talk. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. I love you. You have to believe me. I stood there, staring at her, wondering if she even believed her own words. Do you? I asked, my voice flat. Because I've been wondering how someone who loves me could keep lying like this. I talked to Tim tonight, Catherine. I've seen everything. Her face went white, and she opened her mouth to say something but couldn't get the words out. I could see the fear in her eyes, the moment she realized her usual excuses wouldn't work this time. So what now? I asked, folding my arms. What's your grand explanation for all of this? She took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she tried to hold it together. I don't know, Charles. I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you, but I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand. I was just lost, confused. I felt like we'd grown apart, and I needed someone, to remind me of who I was. The words tumbled out of her, desperate, hollow, like she was grasping for anything that might make sense of her actions. But they didn't make sense. Not to me. I'd heard it all before. I needed to find myself. I didn't mean to hurt you. It was like a script she'd memorized. I just shook my head, feeling more tired than anything else. You needed someone else to remind you of who you were? And that someone just happened to be a guy you'd lie to and sneak around with for months? Tell me, Catherine, what did you expect was going to happen here? That I'd just ignore it? That you could keep it hidden forever? She flinched, tears streaming down her face, but I didn't soften. I'd already given her everything I could, and she'd thrown it away. She tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back. Don't, I said, my voice harsh even to my own ears. Don't try to touch me, don't try to make this better with some half-baked apology. We're past that. Her face twisted in pain, and she sank back down onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. I could tell she didn't know what else to say or do, and part of me almost pitied her. Almost. Finally, she looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I'd been rehearsing these words in my head for days, but saying them out loud felt like tearing open a wound. I want a divorce, I said, each word heavy, final. We're done, Catherine. I'm filing, and I won't back down. I'm not going to keep pretending that what we had is still there. You killed it. She started crying harder, her shoulders shaking, but I didn't move to comfort her. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally standing up for myself. I'd let her excuses, her lies, erode me over the years, but not anymore. I'll be staying with a friend until I get the paperwork together, I added, my voice steady. I'll arrange things with the lawyer, and we'll sort out the rest. But don't expect me to come back. With that, I turned and walked out, grabbing a small bag I'd packed earlier. I didn't look back as I closed the door behind me. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight start to lift, like I was finally free of the web of lies that had trapped me for too long. As I drove away, the reality hit me. My marriage, my life, was over. But for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a beginning. Staying with Mike was strange at first, but he made it easy, giving me the space I needed without prying. He'd just toss me a beer when I walked through the door, then head back to whatever game was on TV. It was a silent kind of support, but it was exactly what I needed. After a couple of nights, though, he couldn't hold back. "Charles," he said as he passed me a beer, "you want to talk about what's actually going on? Or are you just going to stare at my couch until it talks back?" I gave a half-hearted laugh and rubbed my eyes. "Catherine cheated on me, Mike. It's over. I filed for divorce." He stared at me for a second, stunned. "Man, I didn't see that coming. You've been together, what, 25 years?" He looked genuinely angry. "I'm sorry, Charles. No one deserves that." I nodded, but it didn't make the betrayal sting any less. The days crawled by in a fog of phone calls with my lawyer and empty silence, broken only by the occasional text or voicemail from Catherine. She filled my inbox with long, pleading messages, but I didn't read them. I'd had enough of her excuses. Then one afternoon, as I was leaving work, I saw her waiting in the parking lot by my car. She looked nervous, twisting her hands, and rushed over the second she saw me. "Charles, please," she started, blocking my way. I need to talk to you. I know I messed up, but can't we try to fix this? You mean everything to me." I took a steadying breath, looking at her face, the same face I'd trusted for half my life. "Funny, because if I meant everything to you, you wouldn't have done this. You destroyed us, Catherine. It's done." Her eyes filled with tears. "I know I was selfish. I felt so lost, like I didn't know who I was anymore. But I never stopped loving you, Charles. I swear, I never wanted it to end like this." I shook my head, feeling both the anger and sadness swell. "Love? Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it just looks like you did whatever you wanted without thinking twice about me." She looked away, biting her lip, but I had nothing left to give. "I've already filed for divorce. I'm not going back on that." She didn't argue, didn't fight me on it. She just watched as I walked past her, leaving behind everything we'd once had. When I drove away, I didn't look back. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was moving forward. After that parking lot encounter, things settled into a kind of routine. Catherine stopped trying to reach out, and my lawyer kept things moving with the divorce paperwork. Days turned into weeks, and as each one passed, it got a little easier to breathe. Mike was a godsend during all this. He didn't push, didn't treat me like some broken mess. We'd spend most nights sitting on his back porch with a couple of beers, staring at the stars or talking about anything except my crumbling marriage. Sometimes, he'd joke, try to lighten the mood, like when he suggested I sell my wedding ring on eBay and use the money to book a vacation to Cancun. It was ridiculous, but for a second, it made me laugh, something I hadn't done in weeks. One night, after a few beers, he looked over at me, serious for a change. "You ever think about what you'll do once this is all over? I mean, what's next for you, man?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about what came after. I'd been so focused on just surviving each day. "I don't know," I admitted, shrugging. "Start over, I guess. Maybe get out of town for a while. Everything here feels tainted, like it's full of memories I don't want." Mike nodded, thoughtful. "Well, whatever you do, you've got a fresh start coming. Might not feel like it now, but one day you'll look back and realize you dodged a bullet." He was right. Maybe it didn't feel like freedom yet, but deep down, I knew this was my chance to rebuild. It was strange to think about my life without Catherine, without the house we'd shared, or the routines we'd built together. But for the first time, I was starting to see a future that was mine alone. The next morning, I sat down with a list I'd started. Places I'd always wanted to visit. Hobbies I'd never tried. Things that had never seemed possible when I was tied to a life that no longer felt like my own. It was small, but that list felt like hope. Selling the house was both easier and harder than I thought it would be. Part of me felt like I was letting go of a place I'd poured years of life into. But another part, maybe the part of me that was still angry, just wanted to leave it all behind. The memories, the rooms filled with things that felt haunted by the past. Catherine had left it all behind too, so when it was time to sell, I didn't feel any guilt about leaving most of the stuff behind for the new tenants. When I found a buyer, I decided to keep things simple. I told the young couple moving in that they could have the furniture, the appliances, even the decorations. The kitchen table where we'd once laughed with friends over long dinners? Left it. The bed I'd shared with Catherine? Gone. It was like purging the past, letting them make new memories there without any of my own weighing it down. I packed only the basics. Clothes, a couple of old books, a few tools. My truck was filled with maybe half a dozen boxes. It was a weird feeling, standing there in an empty house that no longer felt like mine, knowing I was about to close the door on a chapter of my life that was now behind me. But it felt right. The new place was closer to my family, and Mike's house was just a few blocks away. It wasn't big, just a modest, single-story house with a small yard. But it felt like a clean slate. Fresh walls, no memories etched into them yet, and the smell of fresh paint instead of history. Mike was waiting for me when I pulled up, grinning and leaning against his car. "Welcome back to the land of the living," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as I stepped out of the truck. We started unpacking the few boxes I'd brought, laughing as he realized how little I'd kept. "Man, you really left it all behind, didn't you?" he said, shaking his head. "Yeah," I replied, feeling lighter with every box unloaded. Needed a clean start. That night, after everything was in, we sat on the floor of my empty living room, eating pizza and drinking cheap beer. It wasn't much, but it felt right. Sitting there, surrounded by possibilities instead of regrets. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. Settling into the new house was a slow process, but I didn't mind. For once, I was in no rush to fill the space. I wanted each thing I brought in, each piece of furniture or decoration, to have meaning, to feel like mine and mine alone. I spent weekends wandering local shops, picking up small things, a new lamp, a coffee mug with a quote that made me laugh, a sturdy chair for the living room. Simple things, but each one felt like a step forward. My family started dropping by more often, happy that I'd finally moved closer. My sister would pop over with dinner or an extra pie she'd baked by accident. She was subtle, but I knew she was checking in, making sure I wasn't lost in old memories. Even my mom started coming over now and then, usually with a casserole in hand, insisting that I needed a little home-cooked comfort. I'd missed them more than I'd realized, and their presence filled the house with warmth, reminding me of the simple things I'd almost forgotten in the mess of the last few months. Mike was over practically every other day, always finding a reason to inspect my latest purchases or suggest ways to make the place feel even more like my own. One Saturday, he showed up with a grill he'd found at a garage sale. "You can't have a new place without a proper barbecue setup," he said, looking proud of himself. We spent the afternoon setting it up in the backyard, sharing beers and talking about everything from work to old memories from college. As the sun went down, we lit up the grill, threw on a couple of burgers, and sat back, watching the smoke rise into the night sky. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "it's good to have you here, man. This feels right." I looked around the yard, the house, the few pieces of furniture I'd picked out with my own hands, and nodded. "Yeah," I said, a hint of a smile breaking through. "It does." The weight of the past felt a little lighter, and as the night wore on, I realized that, piece by piece, I was finally building a life that was mine. As the days settled into a routine, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Sure, I had my new place, my family close by, and friends like Mike who'd been there through it all. But my job? It felt like a leftover from my old life, like I was still going through the motions for something that didn't fit who I was anymore. I'd been at the same company for over a decade, working in operations for a big distribution chain. It paid well, but lately, it felt empty. Day after day, I was sitting through the same meetings, dealing with the same reports, watching the clock until I could head home. It wasn't that the work was awful, it just felt like it belonged to someone else. I'd changed, but the job hadn't. One night, as I was flipping through my dad's old tool collection that I'd brought to the new place, an idea started forming. My dad had been a carpenter, and I'd always liked working with my hands, fixing things up. That's what I'd done with this house, piece by piece, and it was the one part of each day that I looked forward to. What if I did that full-time? A small woodworking or handyman business, something I could call my own. The thought was both exciting and a little terrifying. I wasn't young anymore, and starting over in a new field felt risky. But the idea of building something from scratch, with my own name on it, kept growing in the back of my mind. I started spending my evenings researching, reading up on the basics of small business ownership, checking out local woodworking businesses, and watching videos on building custom furniture. Each piece of information made the idea feel more possible, more real. I knew I'd need to save up. Starting a business wasn't cheap, and the initial costs would add up fast. Tools, materials, a small workspace. So, I opened a separate savings account and decided to start setting aside a part of each paycheck. I cut back on a few things, eating out, extra subscriptions, anything that felt unnecessary. Mike laughed when he saw me being so frugal, but when I explained my plan, he was all in. "You'd be great at this, Charles," he said, nodding with confidence. "You've got the skills, and people need someone they can trust. I'll be your first customer if you need one." That small gesture meant more than he probably knew. It reminded me that maybe this wasn't just a dream. Maybe it was the next chapter I'd been looking for. Slowly but surely, I was putting together the pieces of a new life, one that finally felt like my own. The day I quit my job felt like stepping off a cliff. After weeks of saving every spare dollar, of going back and forth with the idea in my head, I finally walked into my boss's office and handed in my resignation. I expected to feel panic or regret, but what I felt instead was relief, a heavy weight lifted, replaced by a strange mix of fear and excitement. That night, I locked myself in my little office at home, a room I hadn't really used much since I'd moved in. I cleared off the desk, grabbed a notebook, and started writing down everything I could think of. Business ideas, service lists, budgets, equipment needs. It was a mess of ideas, but seeing it all laid out on paper made it feel real. I spent the next few days doing nothing but researching and planning, shutting myself away from the world. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and dive in. By noon, I'd be knee-deep in notes, spreadsheets, cost analyses, and market research. I was determined to make this business profitable from the start. I knew there was demand. People needed honest, reliable handyman services and custom work. It was just a matter of finding the right way to offer it. The plan started coming together slowly, bit by bit. I decided on a name, designed a simple logo, and listed out all the services I could offer: woodworking, basic repairs, small renovations, and custom furniture. I researched what other similar businesses in the area charged, how they marketed themselves, and what I could do differently. I wanted to offer quality that would set me apart, something people could count on. I knew I was betting everything on this idea: my savings, my time, and my pride. If it failed, I'd be left with nothing but a few tools and a pile of debt. But the alternative, going back to that same job, working for someone else, living a life that didn't feel like my own, felt worse. This was my shot to rebuild everything from the ground up. Finally, after days of non-stop planning, I looked at my list, my budget, and my goals. It was risky, yes, but it felt right. This wasn't just a way to make money. It was a chance to start over, to create something that reflected who I was now. I took a deep breath, knowing this was the leap I needed to take. And with that, I made my decision. I was all in. If someone had told me a couple of years ago that my life would turn out like this, I'd have laughed. Back then, things were falling apart. My marriage, my home, everything I thought was solid. But here I am now, with a business that's not just surviving but thriving. Every day, I get to do what I love and see the impact of my work. And it's a life I built with my own 2 hands. At first, I was just trying to make ends meet, taking every job I could. But word spread, and soon enough, I had more work than I could handle. I hired a few guys to help out, and we moved into a proper workshop. That was a big moment for me, seeing my name on that shop door, knowing I'd built something real and lasting. It still makes me proud every time I walk in. With the extra income, I started thinking about my folks. They've always been there for me, through every high and low, and I wanted to give something back. So, I started by covering a few bills for them, then eventually paid off their mortgage. It felt incredible to be able to do that for them, knowing I was making their lives a little easier. Every time my mom calls to thank me, I tell her it's the least I could do after everything she's done for me. I even started treating myself in ways I never did before. Bought a new truck, a good, sturdy one that'll last years. Took a weekend trip just for the fun of it, something I hadn't done in ages. It feels strange, this sense of freedom, this feeling that I don't have to say no to every little thing. For the first time in a long time, I don't feel guilty about enjoying what I've worked for. Looking back, I can't help but feel grateful for how things turned out. Losing my old life was painful, sure, but it forced me to start over, to build a life that's mine. Every struggle, every late night, led me to where I am now. And I wouldn't trade this for anything. Strange as it sounds, I'm thankful for everything. The good, the bad, the painful. Because without it, I wouldn't have found the life I was meant to live.